In 1898, a family gathered to capture one last image of someone they loved. The photograph was meant to be a final, somber memory. It was supposed to show stillness, peace, the quiet dignity of death. But when experts examined this picture more than a century later, they noticed something impossible. The subject appeared to be breathing. Victorian families did not see death photography as strange or morbid. These portraits were treasures, often the only visual memory a family would ever have of a deceased loved one. In an era when cameras were expensive and photography sessions rare, most people never had their picture taken while alive. Death became the occasion for a first and final portrait. Families dressed their departed in Sunday best, arranged them in chairs or on beds, and hired photographers to create an image they could keep forever. For grieving parents who lost children to scarlet fever or pneumonia, these photographs were precious beyond measure. The practice was called memento mori, Latin for remember, you must die. It was an act of love, not horror. Olivia worked as an archivist at a regional historical society. Her job involved sorting through boxes of old photographs, letters, and documents donated by local families. Most days brought brittle paper, faded ink, and images of stern-faced strangers staring back from another century. She had seen hundreds of postmortem photographs. They always carried a particular quality, a stillness that was different from ordinary portraits. The subjects looked peaceful, arranged carefully, their eyes closed or sometimes painted open on the final print. She had learned to recognize them instantly. One afternoon in late autumn, Olivia opened a wooden crate from an estate sale. Inside were glass plate negatives wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. She held one up to the light. It showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, seated in an ornate chair. The woman wore a white dress with lace at the collar. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were closed. Everything about the composition suggested a postmortem portrait. But something was wrong. Olivia moved to her light table and placed the negative down for closer inspection. The photograph was sharp. The details were crisp. She could see individual threads in the fabric of the dress, the grain of the wooden chair, even the pattern of the wallpaper behind the subject, except for one area. On the chest, right where the rib cage would rise and fall with breath, there was a blur. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. The blur was localized, affecting only that small region. Around the lips, too, the focus seemed softer than it should be. The rest of the face was sharp, but the mouth had an odd quality, as if caught mid-motion. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen motion blur before in old photographs. When subjects moved during long exposures, they became ghosts, semi-transparent smears across the frame. But this was different. This was too specific, too contained. It looked exactly like what would happen if someone took a slow, shallow breath during the exposure. The subject should have been completely still. The subject should have been dead. She needed a second opinion. Olivia contacted Emma, a historian who specialized in 19th century photography. Emma had written papers on early camera technology and had examined thousands of glass plate negatives. If anyone could explain the anomaly, it would be her. 2 days later, Emma arrived at the archive with a jeweler's loupe and a portable microscope. She spent an hour examining the negative, making notes, measuring the density of the blur with specialized equipment. Emma looked up from the light table. "The negative is original," she said. "This is not damage from age or improper storage. The blur is part of the exposure itself. It was there when the photograph was taken." She explained the technical realities of photography in 1898. Cameras used large glass plates coated with light-sensitive emulsion. Exposures took anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds depending on available light. During that time, nothing could move. Photographers used metal stands with clamps hidden behind the subject to keep them perfectly still. Even the slightest movement would ruin the image. A living person breathing normally would create massive blur across the entire torso. But a tiny movement, something almost imperceptible, could create exactly this kind of subtle blur. The question became obvious. Was this person actually dead when the photograph was taken, or had something gone terribly wrong? Emma suggested they investigate the photographer and the family who commissioned the portrait. Every clue mattered now. The photograph was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was potentially evidence of a tragedy much worse than death itself. It might be evidence of someone being buried alive. Olivia began researching the provenance of the glass plate. The estate sale records listed the previous owner as a descendant of a family named Whitmore. She found a business directory from 1898 listing a photographer named Theodore Grant, who operated a studio on Main Street. Cross-referencing the directory with city records, she located his surviving business ledgers at the County Historical Museum. The ledgers were meticulous. Theodore recorded every session, every client, every payment. In October 1898, there was an entry for a sitting with the Whitmore family. The charge was $3 for a single portrait. In the margin, Theodore had written a note in small, cramped handwriting. Difficult session, it said. Subject, very pale. Family distraught. The note ended there, offering no further explanation. Olivia needed to know more about Theodore Grant. What kind of photographer was he? Was he reputable, or did he cut corners? She found newspaper advertisements for his studio. He marketed himself as a specialist in family portraits and memorials. One advertisement specifically mentioned his experience with postmortem photography, assuring families he would handle their loved ones with dignity and care. By all accounts, Theodore was a skilled professional. He was not someone who would make a careless mistake. The focus shifted to the subject of the photograph, the young woman in the white dress. Olivia found the death certificate filed with the county clerk. The deceased was listed as Amelia Whitmore, age 22, died October 15, 1898. Cause of death was recorded as consumption, the common term for tuberculosis. The certificate was signed by a local doctor named James Holloway. It seemed straightforward enough. Tuberculosis was a leading cause of death in the 1890s. It killed thousands every year. But Olivia felt uneasy. She contacted Liam, a medical historian who studied 19th century healthcare and diagnostic practices. Liam examined the death certificate and the photograph. He explained that diagnosing death in 1898 was not as certain as it is today. Doctors relied on simple tests. They listened for a heartbeat with a stethoscope. They held a mirror to the mouth to check for breath. They looked for signs of rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles after death. But these methods were not foolproof. Some medical conditions could mimic death so convincingly that even trained physicians were fooled. One condition was called catalepsy, a state where the body became rigid and unresponsive. Breathing and heartbeat could slow to nearly undetectable levels. Another condition was a deep coma brought on by fever or poisoning. In both cases, a person could appear dead for hours or even days. The fear of premature burial was very real in the Victorian era. Newspapers regularly published stories of coffins being opened to reveal scratch marks on the inside of the lid. Patents were filed for safety coffins equipped with bells and breathing tubes. Some designs included flags that would pop up above ground if the buried person moved. The terror was so widespread that wealthy families sometimes hired guards to watch over graves for the first few nights after burial. This was not superstition. This was a response to documented cases of people waking up after being declared dead. Liam pulled up historical medical journals from the 1890s. He found case studies of patients who had been pronounced dead only to revive hours later. In one case from 1897, a woman with tuberculosis stopped breathing and had no detectable pulse. Her family prepared her body for burial. Just before the coffin was sealed, someone noticed warmth in her hand. She was still alive. She recovered and lived another 10 years. The article concluded with a warning to physicians to be more cautious when declaring death in cases of wasting diseases. Could Amelia Whitmore have been in a cataleptic state when Theodore took her photograph? Could she have been alive, breathing so shallowly that her family and the doctor missed it? The possibility was horrifying. But Liam cautioned against jumping to conclusions. He suggested they look more closely at the photographer's methods and the physical evidence in the image itself. There might be another explanation, one rooted in the science of photography rather than the failures of medicine. Emma returned to examine the photograph with fresh eyes. She brought with her reference materials, including daguerreotypes and ambrotypes from the same era. She wanted to understand exactly how Theodore Grant would have set up the shot. Victorian postmortem photographers used specific techniques to pose their subjects. Bodies were often placed in chairs with hidden armatures, metal frames that supported the torso and head. These stands were essential. Even a dead body could slump or shift slightly over the course of a long exposure. The goal was absolute stillness. Emma studied the photograph again. She noticed the way Amelia was positioned in the chair. The posture was very upright, almost too perfect. The head was tilted at a specific angle. These were telltale signs of a posing stand. Emma explained that the stand would have been clamped to Amelia's back, hidden behind her body. The clamp held her firmly in place, but here was the critical detail. Even with the stand, a body was not truly rigid. Muscles relaxed after death. Tissues settled. Gravity pulled everything downward, slowly, imperceptibly. Over the course of a 20-second exposure, a body could shift by a fraction of an inch. That tiny movement would be invisible to the naked eye, but the camera would record it. Emma proposed a hypothesis. What if the blur on Amelia's chest was not caused by breathing, but by the slow settling of her body during the exposure? The posing stand held her torso in place, but it could not stop the microscopic shifts that occur in all dead tissue. The rib cage could compress slightly as muscles lost their tone. The chest could sink inward by a millimeter or two. To the camera, holding its shutter open for 20 seconds, that tiny motion would register as a blur. It would look exactly like a breath. The softness around the lips could be explained the same way. The facial muscles, no longer held taut by life, would relax during the exposure, creating a subtle loss of sharpness. It was a compelling explanation. But Olivia wanted to test it. She asked Emma if there were any other photographs from the same era that showed similar blurring. Emma nodded. She had seen it before, though rarely. Most post-mortem photographers worked quickly and used shorter exposures to avoid exactly this problem. But in low-light conditions, or when using certain types of glass plates, longer exposures were necessary. And when that happened, the subtle physics of a dead body could create unexpected effects on film. Emma showed Olivia 3 other examples from her research. In each case, there was a small, localized blur on the torso of the deceased subject. In each case, the blur had been mistaken for breath or movement. In each case, the explanation was the same: post-mortem settling during a long exposure. Liam reviewed the medical records again. He found additional details about Amelia's illness. She had been sick for 6 months. Her family had cared for her at home. In the days before her death, she had been bedridden and unconscious. The doctor's notes described her as unresponsive, with labored breathing and a weak pulse. On the morning of October 15th, the doctor was called to the house. He examined Amelia and found no heartbeat, no breath, no signs of life. He pronounced her dead at 9 in the morning. The photograph was taken that afternoon. Liam considered the timeline. If Amelia had been in a cataleptic state, she would have shown some signs of life during the hours between the doctor's visit and the photograph. Her family would have been with her constantly, preparing her body, dressing her, moving her to the parlor. They would have touched her skin, arranged her hair, positioned her hands. If she had been breathing, even faintly, someone would have noticed. The intimate process of preparing a body for a memorial photograph left no room for such a mistake. Families knew their loved ones. They would have seen warmth in the skin, color in the lips, the smallest rise and fall of the chest. But there was more evidence to consider. Olivia found letters written by Amelia's sister, a woman named Emma Whitmore, in the weeks after the funeral. The letters were addressed to a cousin in another state. In them, Emma described the overwhelming grief of losing her sister. She wrote about the final days of Amelia's illness, the vigil at her bedside, the moment she stopped breathing. Emma described holding Amelia's hand as she died, feeling the last faint pulse fade away. The grief in those letters was raw and real. There was no doubt, no hesitation, no hint of uncertainty. Amelia was dead. Her family knew it. They had been there. The evidence was clear. Amelia Whitmore died of tuberculosis on October 15, 1898. She was dead when Theodore Grant took her photograph. The blur on her chest was not evidence of breathing. It was evidence of physics. It was the result of a body settling under the force of gravity during a long camera exposure. The illusion of breath was created by the limitations of the technology and the inevitable changes that occur in a body after death. There was no medical error. There was no premature burial. There was only a family's grief and a photographer's skill, intersecting in a moment captured on glass. Emma explained the final piece of the puzzle. Human beings are wired to see patterns, especially patterns that suggest life. We see faces in clouds, animals in shadows, and movement in stillness. When we look at a photograph of a person, our brains expect to see signs of life. We look for the rise and fall of breath, the warmth of skin, the subtle movements that define a living body. When we see a blur in the chest area, our minds interpret it as breathing because that is what we expect to see. It is a cognitive bias, one that has fooled people for as long as photography has existed. The photograph of Amelia Whitmore is not proof of the supernatural. It is not evidence of a mistake or a tragedy beyond the tragedy of her death. It is a historical document, a piece of glass that captured light and shadow in a specific way. It shows us the limitations of technology in 1898 and the universal human experience of loss. It reminds us that grief can make us see things that are not there, that the desire to hold on to a loved one can make us believe in impossible things. But it also shows us the care and love that families felt for their dead. They wanted one last image, one last memory, one last way to say they would never forget. Olivia returned the glass plate negative to its archival box. She wrote a detailed report on her findings, documenting the investigation, the consultations with Emma and Liam, and the final conclusion. The photograph would remain in the collection, available for researchers and historians to study. But it would no longer be a mystery. It would be what it always was, a memorial to a young woman who died too soon, created by a family who loved her and a photographer who did his best to honor their grief. The case of the 1898 photograph is a reminder that history is full of details we can misinterpret. Old photographs, letters, and documents can seem to hold secrets, but often they are simply showing us the world as it was, with all its limitations and tragedies. The blur on Amelia's chest is not a ghost. It is not a sign of life. It is a shadow of death, made visible by the slow, patient eye of a camera. It is a reminder that even in stillness, even in death, the physical world is always moving, always changing, always slipping away from us, one imperceptible moment at a time. What other secrets are hidden in the details of old photographs, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be understood? Every image holds a story, a moment frozen in time, a piece of the past that can teach us something about the people who came before us. If you found this investigation fascinating, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts on Victorian photography, on the fear of premature burial, on the ways we remember the dead. Subscribe to see more deep dives into historical mysteries. And remember, not everything that looks impossible actually is. Sometimes the answer is simpler than we think. Sometimes the truth is written in the blur of a light on glass, waiting for us to see it clearly.